All right. Welcome back to Cheating Lady Flies. You know, some people think a joke isn't serious until the other person stops laughing. All right. This is one of those stories where everything sounds normal, at least until you actually start paying attention. And once he did, things stopped making sense very quickly. You know, there's a specific kind of disrespect that hides behind the word joke. The kind where someone says something that cuts straight through you, and then watches your face and says, "Relax, I'm just kidding." And maybe the first time you do relax. Maybe the second time you give the benefit of the doubt. But by the 15th time, it stops being a joke. It becomes a position, a preference someone isn't brave enough to say out loud directly. So they dress it up in humor and dare you to take it seriously. Stephanie took that approach for about 2 years, and I let her until I didn't. My name is Eric Collins. I'm 34 years old. I work in logistics management. Specifically, I oversee distribution coordination for a mid-size freight company based out of Columbus, Ohio. It's not glamorous work. It's spreadsheets and scheduling calls and the occasional crisis at 2 in the morning when a shipment gets held up somewhere between here and a warehouse in Memphis. But it pays well, it's stable, and I'm good at it. I met Stephanie when I was 28. She was 26, working as a dental office coordinator, sharp sense of humor, quick smile, the kind of person who made a room feel more energized just by being in it. We dated for about 1.5 years before I proposed. Got married the following spring. Small ceremony, her family, mine, a few close friends, a reception at a venue outside the city that Stephanie had picked out and planned almost entirely on her own, because that's the kind of detail-oriented person she was. For the first year of marriage, things were fine. Good, even. We had our rhythms, we had our routines, we argued occasionally the way people do, but nothing that felt like a structural problem. Just the normal friction of two people building a shared life. The first time she mentioned Jason Wade, we'd been married about 14 months. We were watching television, some dating competition show she liked, and one of the contestants did something romantic and over the top, and Stephanie laughed and said, "Jason would have done something like that. He was always like that." I didn't say anything. I registered the name, noted the tone, fond, slightly nostalgic, and filed it away. Everyone has an ex. Everyone has history. That's not unusual. I didn't think much of it. The second mention came maybe 3 weeks later. We were at a restaurant with another couple, her friend Dana and Dana's husband Marcus, and the conversation drifted to that familiar territory of how people met, early relationship stories, the funny and awkward moments. Stephanie brought up Jason again. Not in a way that was inappropriate exactly, just present. She mentioned a trip they'd taken, a beach somewhere, the way he'd planned the whole thing as a surprise. I watched her face while she talked about it. There was a softness there that I noticed. Dana noticed too, because she gave Stephanie a quick look and then glanced at me, and I kept my expression neutral and took a sip of my drink and let the conversation move on. That was the thing about the Jason mentions in the early days. They weren't aggressive. They weren't obviously inappropriate. They were just frequent and a little too warm for a person who was supposed to be entirely in the past. I asked Stephanie about him once directly, about 2 months in. Just casual. "You mention Jason sometimes. What happened there? Why'd it end?" She shrugged, said it just ran its course. Said they were together for almost 3 years, but eventually the timing was off, they wanted different things, it faded out. No big dramatic ending. Just finished. I accepted that. It was a reasonable answer. People date for years, and part ways without catastrophe sometimes. That's real life. What I didn't know then, and wouldn't understand for a while, was that the way Stephanie talked about Jason had a quality to it that was different from how you talk about someone you've moved on from. It had the quality of someone who hadn't fully closed the door. Someone who kept the window cracked, just slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to let a little air in. I'm not sure exactly when the joke started. It was gradual enough that I couldn't point to a first instance. But somewhere around the 18-month mark, a pattern emerged. We'd be talking about something, a vacation we were planning. Something one of us wanted to change about the apartment. Some small disagreement about money or time or priorities, and Stephanie would say something like, "Jason never cared about stuff like this. He was just easy." Or Jason would have just said yes and figured it out. Or, and this one started appearing more often than I was comfortable with, "Sometimes I think I should have just stayed with Jason." The first few times she'd say it with a half smile, like it was self-deprecating, like she was poking fun at herself for the thought. And I'd either not respond or say something like, yeah, and miss all this and move on. But it kept coming. And it started to feel less like a passing comment and more like something she was testing, like she was dangling it to see what I'd do with it, to see if I'd get upset or push back or get insecure. I didn't get upset, that's not my style, but I started paying attention in a different way. I started noticing how often his name came up. I started noticing what triggered it, usually any moment of friction between us. Any time I didn't give her exactly what she wanted, any time she was mildly frustrated or bored. Jason became a kind of measuring stick, a benchmark she kept returning to, a way of communicating, you are not meeting the standard. And here's the thing about that, she never actually told me what the standard was. She just kept referencing it obliquely, through the lens of someone who didn't seem to be entirely present in our marriage. About 22 months in, the jokes got sharper. We were at her parents' house for a Sunday dinner. Her mom, her dad, her younger sister Kara, and her dad made some comment about marriage, something lighthearted about how you have to compromise, and Stephanie laughed and said, honestly, sometimes I think I'd just rather have married Jason. The table went quiet for about 2 seconds. Her mom did a polite laugh. Her dad looked at me. Kara looked at her plate. I picked up my fork and kept eating. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a bad habit. This was something she was doing consciously enough to do it in front of her family, in front of people who knew both of us. And she was doing it with the casual ease of someone who either didn't care how it landed or had decided that it wouldn't have consequences. I drove home that night and said almost nothing. Stephanie was in a fine mood, chatting about her parents, about Kara's new job, about nothing. Like the comment at the table had been completely unremarkable, I let her talk. I was doing something I do when I'm processing something important. I was getting very still, very quiet. I was starting to take an actual inventory of what my marriage looked like from a distance instead of from inside it. And from a distance, it didn't look the way I'd thought it did. There was an emotional distance that I'd been chalking up to normal long-term relationship adjustment. There were weeks where Stephanie seemed genuinely uninterested in being around me. She'd come home, go through the motions, dinner, television, phone, bed, but there wasn't a lot of warmth in it, not lately. She'd started going to the gym in the evenings, which wasn't unusual. She'd always been health conscious, but the evenings had gotten longer. She used to be back by 7:30. Lately it was closer to 9. She'd started being protective of her phone in a way that was subtle but real. Not hiding it exactly, but keeping it face down. Stepping slightly away before answering certain calls. Nothing dramatic. Just a small shift in behavior that I'd noticed and set aside. I'd set a lot of things aside. That's the honest version. I'd been giving benefit of the doubt in installments, and I hadn't stopped to tally what I'd already extended. I want to be clear about something because it matters for understanding how this unfolded. I had been wrong before. About 2 years before I met Stephanie. About in a serious relationship with a woman named Claire. We'd been together almost 2 years. We were talking about moving in together, and I started picking up on signals that felt like something was off. The way she was talking about a coworker. The way she'd get quiet sometimes when her phone buzzed. I built a case in my head. I confronted her, laid out my suspicions with the quiet confidence of someone who was sure they were right. She was devastated and completely innocent. The coworker was gay and had become one of her closest friends. The phone behavior was because she'd been planning a surprise for my birthday and didn't want me to see the group chat. I had taken legitimate patterns and constructed a false conclusion, and the damage it did to that relationship was significant. We stayed together another few months after that, but it never fully recovered. The trust, her trust in me, her belief that I saw her clearly, was broken. I carried that forward. It made me hesitant to act on instinct. It made me deliberate in a way that sometimes looked like passivity. So when I started feeling the shift with Stephanie, I was careful. I didn't want to be the man who jumped to conclusions again. I wanted to be sure about what I was seeing before I decided what it meant. But there was something I was sure about, even at this early stage. Something that didn't require investigation to confirm. The jokes about Jason weren't okay. Whatever else was happening or wasn't happening, a wife who regularly told her husband, in private, in public, at family dinners, that she wished she'd married someone else was doing something that couldn't be explained away by, she's just joking. Jokes have a direction. They point somewhere, and every time Stephanie laughed and said she should have married Jason, the direction was the same, away from me, towards someone else. I just hadn't decided what to do with that yet. I want to give you the full picture of our living situation at this point, because it matters. We owned a house together, a 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from the city. We'd bought it 18 months into the marriage. It was a good house. We'd put real effort into it. Stephanie had decorated most of it, which she was talented at, and I'd done the structural projects. Built the deck out back, refinished the basement, repainted most of the interior over 2 weekends. We had 2 cars. Mine was a 4-year-old gray SUV, practical high mileage. Hers was a newer white sedan she'd picked out herself. No kids. We'd talked about it. Stephanie wanted to wait. I was open to either. It had never become urgent enough to force a decision, which in retrospect I was glad about. Her income was decent. Dental office coordinator at a well-established practice, decent salary, good hours. Mine was significantly more, which meant most of the mortgage and larger expenses fell to me. That wasn't a source of resentment. I made more. It made sense. But I was aware of it. It was a structural reality of our arrangement. The practical dynamic of our marriage was that I provided most of the financial stability, and she managed most of the household and social logistics. It worked. It had worked well for a while. What I was only starting to clock around the 23rd or 24th month was that the emotional investment had shifted in a way that was hard to ignore once you stopped making excuses for it. Stephanie had become less engaged, less present, not hostile. She wasn't mean or cold in an obvious way. She was pleasant. She was functional. But there was a kind of going through the motions quality to her engagement with me that I'd been rationalizing as stress, as adjustment, as the natural evolution of early marriage excitement into comfortable routine. I stopped rationalizing it the night she said it in front of her family. I wasn't angry. I want to be precise about that. I wasn't the kind of angry that makes a person act impulsively. I was something quieter, something more considered. I was starting to ask myself a question I hadn't let myself ask directly before. What do I actually want this marriage to be? And is it capable of being that? The month following the dinner at her parents' house, I started paying attention in a different way. Not obsessive, not paranoid, just attentive. The way you get when you've been not looking at something for a while and you finally decide to actually look at it. The gym evenings continued. 2 to 3 times a week, she'd leave around 6:30, come back between 8:30 and 9, sometimes 9:15. She always came back freshly showered, which wasn't unusual for someone who just worked out, except that the gym was 8 minutes from our house and she could shower at home. She used to shower at home. I didn't say anything about it. I noted it. Her phone habits evolved. The face-down thing became standard. She'd started taking it to the bathroom with her consistently. Not occasionally, consistently. She'd started responding to some messages quickly and others not at all. And I'd noticed that the selective responsiveness seemed to operate on a timing pattern, like she was waiting for certain moments when I wasn't in the room. Again, none of this is proof of anything. I knew that. I was not going to make the same mistake I'd made with Claire. I was not going to build a case on circumstantial behavior and then confront her with it and be wrong. But I was watching. The Jason mentions didn't slow down. If anything, they increased in frequency and became more direct. One evening, I came home from work to find Stephanie in a good mood, which had become rarer, so I noticed it. And she was talking about a movie she'd watched, and somehow the conversation arrived at a moment where she said, almost cheerfully, "Jason used to love movies like this. We'd watch them every Friday." I looked at her for a second, just looked at her. She met my eyes, still smiling, and said, "What?" I said nothing and went to the kitchen. That was the moment the joke stopped feeling like carelessness and started feeling intentional. The way she said it, cheerfully, directly, making eye contact, had the quality of someone who wanted a reaction, who was poking at something to see if it would move. I didn't give her the reaction, but I filed it. The following week, a Tuesday, I was working from home and Stephanie had taken a half day. She came home around noon and we had lunch together, and it was actually pleasant. One of the better interactions we'd had in a while. She was relaxed, talkative, funny in the way she used to be regularly. We laughed about something. It felt like the earlier version of us, briefly. And then about an hour later, she was on her phone and I was at my desk and I heard her laugh, a very specific laugh, not the general laugh, a low, warm, private laugh. The kind of laugh that's not meant to carry. I didn't look up from my work. I didn't say anything. About 5 minutes later, she said she was going to run some errands and left. She was gone for 3 hours. She came back with 2 bags from a grocery store and 1 from a home goods place and was perfectly normal the rest of the evening. Sure, I started thinking about patterns more systematically. Not just what I was observing now, but the full timeline of the last several months. When had things started to feel different? Not the small behavioral stuff, the bigger emotional shift. When had Stephanie started feeling like someone who was only partially present in our marriage? I landed on about 6 months prior, which would put it around the 18-month mark of the marriage, which was also roughly when the Jason mentions had escalated from occasional to regular. I wasn't concluding anything definitive from that correlation, but I was holding it. I thought about the things she'd said about him over the 2 years I'd been cataloging the pattern. The beach trip he'd planned as a surprise, the way he was just easy, the movies on Fridays. Small, specific, vivid details, not the hazy generalities of distant memory, but the crisp particulars of someone who still had that person in focus. She never mentioned how long ago those things were. She never framed them as back then or a long time ago. She referenced them like they were adjacent, like they were in the recent room of her mind, not the archive. I thought about the gym timing and the phone behavior and the private laugh. Individually, each of those things was explicable. Together, they had a shape. I want to be honest about my emotional state during this period, because I think it matters for understanding how I handled what came next. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't falling apart. I was something more controlled than that, almost disturbingly so, if I'm being candid. I was operating in a kind of slow, methodical state that felt more like project management than grief. I was gathering information. I was building understanding. I was not ready to feel the full weight of what might be true yet, so I wasn't letting myself go there. That's how I've always operated under pressure. I narrow the field. I work the problem. Feelings come after the situation is understood, not before and not during. Whether that's healthy or not is a conversation for another day. What it meant practically was that I was calm, functional, present at work, present enough at home, not doing anything that would alert Stephanie to the fact that my level of attention had changed. She had no idea I was paying this much attention. At least, that's what I was counting on. The thing that shifted the pattern from possible to probable happened on a Friday evening, about 5 weeks after the dinner at her parents' house. Stephanie had told me earlier in the week that she was going to do a girls' night with Dana and a couple of other friends from her work. A dinner, maybe drinks after, probably home by 11 or midnight. I said sure, no issue. I had no reason to question it. She and Dana did this regularly enough that it was genuinely unremarkable. She left around 6:30, dressed nicely, not overdressed, not in a way that would trigger immediate suspicion, but put together in a way that read as more than a casual dinner with friends. Her hair was done. She was wearing the earrings she saved for occasions she cared about. I noted it. I texted her around 9, casual, just a how's dinner going? And she responded quickly, so fun. These girls are hilarious. Probably one more drink. She was home by 12:15, which was consistent with what she'd said. I was still awake when she came in. I was reading. She came into the bedroom, said hi, said the night was fun, went to shower. Everything was normal. Everything tracked. Except the next morning, Dana called the house phone. Now, this requires a small explanation. We still had a landline, mostly because Stephanie's parents were older and preferred calling it, and we'd kept it out of habit. It rang maybe once a week. Stephanie almost always answered it if she was home, because it was almost always for her. But Stephanie was in the shower, so I picked up. Dana said, "Hey, is Stephanie around? Tell her I found her scarf, I'll bring it by later." I said, "Sure, she'll be happy to hear that. Was it a good time last night?" And Dana paused just slightly, just 1/2 beat longer than comfortable, and said, "Oh, yeah, it was fun. Tell her I'll be by around too." And that was it. She hung up. A pause like that doesn't mean anything on its own. People pause in conversation. People have half-second hesitations that mean nothing. But combined with everything else, the pattern, the behavior, the escalating Jason references, the phone, the gym, that pause meant something. I didn't have confirmation. I wasn't going to act on a pause, but I had a direction. What happened over the next 2 weeks was something I'd call a quiet accumulation of certainty. Not one dramatic moment. Just a series of small, clear data points that kept pointing the same way. Stephanie's phone, which had been face down for months, started getting more actively managed. She'd pick it up, check something, put it away, pick it up again. Not frantic, but active, like she was monitoring something. She started being less available on Wednesday evenings. She'd been doing gym on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The Wednesdays got longer. Sometimes she wouldn't be back until 9:45, 10 o'clock. She always came back from the gym looking showered, calm, slightly tired. She started mentioning Jason in a different way, less I should have married Jason and more just his name dropped casually into observations. Jason always said that about people like that. Or, that's funny, Jason would have hated that restaurant, like he was a figure she was currently in dialogue with in her head, rather than a memory from years ago. I started paying attention to what those references revealed. They were too current. They were too contextually alive. They weren't being generated from memory. They were being refreshed. That's what told me the most, ultimately. Not the gym timing, not the phone, not Dana's pause, the Jason references. Because you can manufacture an alibi. You can cover a schedule. You can get careful about your phone. But you can't always control what your mind keeps returning to. And Stephanie's mind kept returning to Jason with a frequency and a freshness that only made sense if he was still actively present in her life in some form. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I went back to being still. Here's the thing about evidence. When you're finally ready to look for it, it tends to show up fairly quickly. I wasn't hacking into her phone. I wasn't hiring someone. I wasn't doing anything dramatic. I was just paying close attention to what was already visible, and I was applying the same methodical approach I'd use at work when I needed to audit a process that wasn't performing correctly. The first concrete thing I found was a receipt. Stephanie was organized about paperwork, which meant she had a system. Bills and documents went in a folder in the kitchen desk drawer. Personal items went in her bag or her nightstand. Receipts for house-related purchases went on the counter until they were filed or discarded. It was an efficient system. I respected it. I'd never had reason to look through her things closely before. But one evening she was out and I was going through the kitchen drawer looking for our insurance card. Completely routine, completely legitimate reason to be in that drawer, and I found a receipt folded into a small square and tucked under the folder. Not filed, tucked, separately. In a way that was different from how she handled everything else. I unfolded it. It was from a restaurant. The kind of place that's not casual, not a special occasion place exactly, but a step above where you'd go for a regular Tuesday dinner. The date was a Wednesday, about 3 weeks prior. The time was 7:42 p.m., which put it squarely within her gym window. The total was $64, which for 2 people was about right for that type of restaurant. 1 check. 2 people's worth of food and drinks. She'd been at the gym. I refolded it exactly the way I'd found it, tucked it back in the same spot, and put the drawer back together. I wasn't angry. I was something colder than angry. I was now operating with my first piece of actual tangible evidence. Not a feeling, not a pattern. A receipt that placed her at a sit-down restaurant during a time she'd said she was at the gym. I sat with that for a day. Then I started being more systematic. The gym she went to had its own app, which I'd downloaded on my phone at one point because we'd briefly considered a joint membership. I'd never created an account. That hadn't gone anywhere, but I knew the app existed and I knew it pulled from the gym's check-in system. I don't have access to her account, but I know how to look at data that's available without needing her access. The gym had a parking lot that pulled off a main road, and that main road had a gas station on the corner with exterior cameras that were visible from the street. This is not information I'd noted with any kind of surveillance purpose. I'd just driven past it dozens of times and registered it the way you register the physical details of places you pass regularly. What I'm saying is, I knew that if her car was in that parking lot on a Wednesday evening, it would be visible on that camera's recording, which the gas station kept for about 2 weeks before cycling. And I had a reason to need gas. This is going to sound calculated. It was. I was in a calculated state of mind. If you're judging that, I understand. But I was not going to make the mistake of confronting my wife without being sure. I had made that mistake before with a different woman, with zero justification, and I had destroyed something real because of it. I was not doing that again. Not without proof. I went to get gas on a Wednesday evening, about 45 minutes after Stephanie had left for the gym. Her car was not in the parking lot. I checked from a different angle to make sure I wasn't missing something. I wasn't. The lot was visible and her white sedan was not in it. She arrived home at 9:20 that night, freshly showered, with her gym bag. Right. I want to pause here and acknowledge something, because I think it's important for how this story is understood. At no point during this period did I say anything to Stephanie. I didn't make a comment. I didn't act differently. I didn't give her a look that communicated suspicion. I went about our life in exactly the same way I had been, and I did not give her any reason to think the ground had shifted. Some people might see that as cold, as calculated in a way that's almost unsettling. Maybe they're right. But here's how I saw it. Stephanie had been managing a deception, whatever the specific shape of it was, for what appeared to be several months. She had been doing it calmly, efficiently, while smiling at me, while coming home and having conversations with me, while making jokes about wishing she'd married someone else. She had not given me the courtesy of honesty. I was not going to give her the warning of suspicion. We were in a dark way, even on that score. The phone situation resolved itself in a way I hadn't engineered. I want to be precise about how this happened, because I am not the kind of person who snoops through a partner's private messages without cause, and by this point I felt I had cause. But I also want to be clear that what happened was as much circumstance as intention. She left her phone on the kitchen counter one evening and went outside to check on something in the backyard. She was outside for maybe 5 minutes. I was making coffee. Her phone screen lit up with a message. I wasn't standing over it. I wasn't waiting for it. I was standing at the coffee maker, which is approximately 4 feet from the counter where her phone was sitting. The screen was face up because she'd been using it. The message preview showed a name, just a name, and the first part of a message. I won't reproduce it exactly, but what I'll tell you is that the name was not a woman's name, and the message had a register. A familiar, warm, casual register. That was not how you message a work contact or a distant acquaintance. The name started with a J. I turned back to the coffee maker. She came back inside 30 seconds later, picked up her phone, looked at the screen, and went to the other room. That was confirmation enough for what I needed to know. Not that I was happy about it. Over the following 10 days, I built out what I needed to understand. I'm going to be direct about this. I was paying attention to her location in the ways that were available to me without requiring anything covert. We shared a family plan. I could see data usage patterns. I could note timing. I could observe behavior. What I confirmed over those 10 days, the gym on Wednesdays was not the gym. 2 out of 3 Wednesdays, her location data showed her in a neighborhood I recognized, about 12 minutes from our house, in the direction of a cluster of apartment complexes and a few residential streets. Not a commercial area, residential, where people live. The Friday girls' nights with Dana had not always been what she'd described. I spoke to Dana. This required a conversation, which I'll explain, and Dana, her significant credit, is not a good liar when directly and calmly asked a direct question. I called Dana on a Wednesday afternoon. I kept it simple. I said I had some concerns and I wanted to ask her something directly, and I was not calling to start anything or involve her in anything complicated. I just needed a straight answer to one question. I asked whether Stephanie had been with her on all the evenings she'd said she was at girls' nights. Dana was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "Eric, I don't want to be in the middle of this." I said, "I understand, and I'm not asking you to be in the middle of it. I'm asking because I need to know if I'm dealing with something real or if I'm making something out of nothing. If the answer is that she's always been where she said she was, tell me that, and I'll take it at face value and move on. I just need to know." Another pause. She said, "I'm sorry. I think you should talk to Stephanie." That was my answer. Dana wasn't going to tell me the specifics. That was fine. She didn't need to. What she told me was enough. She didn't say she's always been with us. She said, "Talk to Stephanie." Those are very different sentences. Here's what I knew at this point with reasonable confidence. Stephanie was spending time, regularly, on a pattern schedule with someone. That someone's name started with J. The behavior aligned, chronologically and behaviorally, with the escalation of the Jason Wade references. The deception had been active for at minimum 3 to 4 months, probably longer. Dana knew or suspected and had covered for Stephanie at least once. I had a receipt, I had location data, I had a message preview, I had Dana's non-denial, and I had 2+ years of my wife telling me, in a variety of social settings, that she should have married her ex. Here's what I also knew. There was going to be no dramatic confrontation. There was going to be no shouting, no accusations, no theater. There was going to be something far simpler and far more permanent. But before I acted, I wanted to understand one more thing. I wanted to understand what Stephanie actually thought she was doing, what she thought the situation was. Whether she was planning to leave on her own timeline, or whether she'd decided she could simply continue indefinitely, maintaining both the marriage and whatever this other thing was, and manage me as a variable in that equation. I wanted to know how confident she was that this would just keep working. So I gave her a chance to show me. What I needed before I moved was a complete picture, not 80% of a picture. Not probably true with a few gaps. A complete picture. Where, when, who, how long. I knew the who with reasonable certainty. I knew the where by approximation. I needed the how long, and I needed to understand what, if any, endgame Stephanie had in her mind. I also needed to handle some things on my own side before anything else happened. I scheduled an appointment with a family law attorney on a Thursday morning during work hours. I'd chosen her specifically. Someone who came recommended and who had a reputation for being straightforward and pragmatic rather than adversarial. I didn't want someone who was going to turn this into a war. I wanted someone who could tell me what the situation looked like legally and what my options were. The conversation was clarifying. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided based on what's considered fair, not necessarily equal. The house, which we'd purchased jointly, though I'd contributed the larger share of the down payment, would be a central asset. The attorney walked me through scenarios, made note of the timeline and contribution records I described, and gave me a clear sense of what a realistic outcome looked like. I left that meeting with a folder of notes and a clearer head. I also separately had a conversation with my brother Daniel, who is the only person in my life I trust with something like this completely. He's 3 years older than me, steady, minimal drama. I told him what I'd found and what I was considering. He listened. He asked a few questions. He said, "Do what you need to do. I'll back you up however you need." That was all I needed from him. Now, back to Stephanie. I had decided I wanted to hear her say certain things out loud before I moved. I wanted to hear her lie directly to my face, with full knowledge, because I think there's something important about not carrying ambiguity into a major decision. I wanted to go into this without any part of me wondering if I'd somehow read it wrong. I'd done that once before. Spent months convinced of something that wasn't true. The only thing worse than being betrayed is being wrong about the betrayal. I needed to be standing on completely solid ground. I set up the moment carefully. This wasn't a trap in the theatrical sense. It was more like creating a clear, unambiguous test case. On a Sunday afternoon, I brought up the idea of going away for our upcoming anniversary, 2 weeks out at that point. Third anniversary, I suggested a weekend trip somewhere nice. Asked what she thought. Stephanie's reaction was interesting. She was warm about it initially. "Oh, that would be so nice." And then she got thoughtful, and then she started hedging. Said she'd have to check with work about a Friday. Said she wasn't sure about that specific weekend. Maybe we could look at dates. Nothing alarming in isolation. But I just watched her navigate the idea of a dedicated anniversary weekend with me and react with logistical hesitation rather than enthusiasm. I filed it. 2 days later, a Tuesday, I mentioned that I'd looked at some options for the trip and found a place I thought she'd really like. I showed her a listing on my laptop. Nice coastal property, the kind of aesthetic she gravitated toward. She looked at it. She said it was beautiful. And then she said, "Can I think about it? I just want to make sure the timing works." "Sure, think about it." Wednesday came. She left for the gym around 6:30. I was home. At 9:15, she texted me. "Running a little late, might be 9:45 or so," I said. "No problem." She came home at 9:52, freshly showered, fine mood, nothing unusual. I said, "How was the gym?" She said, "Good. Did some cardio, it was crowded." "Wednesday nights are always like that," I said. "Yeah," she said. "The gym closes at 9 on Wednesdays." She knew I didn't know that. Actually, I did know that. I'd checked. I didn't say anything about it. I just knew. Friday of that week. She mentioned she was going to get dinner with Dana. Just the two of them, low-key, probably back by 9. I said, "Tell Dana I said hi." She left at 6:45. I waited until 7:30, then sent a short text. "Hey, Dan and I are grabbing food. Want me to pick anything up for you on the way home later?" This was fiction. Daniel is in Cleveland. But the point of the text was simple. She responded within 4 minutes. No, I'm good. Have fun. Dana says hi, by the way." She was with Dana. Except, I'd also texted Dana about 10 minutes earlier. I kept it brief. I texted Dana's number and said, "Hey Dana, it's Eric. Sorry to bother you. Quick question, no drama. Is Stephanie with you tonight?" Dana responded about 8 minutes later. "Hi Eric, I'm actually home tonight. Is everything okay?" So, Stephanie had just told me Dana said hi. While Dana was at home, I replied to Dana, "Everything's fine, thank you." I replied to Stephanie, "Sounds good. Be safe." At that point, I had everything I needed. I wasn't going to be accused of making assumptions. I wasn't going to be told I read something wrong or built a conclusion on a feeling. I had multiple independent confirmations across multiple instances. I had the receipt, the locations, the message, Dana's non-denial, and now a direct, real-time lie, delivered casually and quickly and confidently. She was very confident. I'll give her that. The kind of confident that comes from having done something so many times. It stops feeling risky. Now, I want to talk about the Jason situation, because it had its own arc that I hadn't fully mapped until this point. I knew his last name, Wade, from things Stephanie had mentioned over the years. I knew he worked in something related to finance or sales, though she'd been vague about specifics. I knew they'd dated for almost 3 years before she and I met. I did something I'm not going to dress up as anything other than what it was. I looked him up. LinkedIn. Facebook, the basic available public information. Jason Wade, 32 years old. In the same city, he worked in commercial insurance, sales side, a Facebook profile that was semi-public, which told me some things. He was not, by the picture he presented publicly, the version that Stephanie seemed to have preserved in her mind. Not bad by any means. Average, functional, nothing especially notable. But the profile had markers that were quietly revealing. He'd cycled through several jobs in 4 years. His posts had a quality that I'd describe as perpetually unresolved. The kind of energy that reads as someone who's always about to do something significant but hasn't quite yet. A few years older than when Stephanie had dated him, carrying some of the weight that time puts on things that haven't found their footing. I'm not being cruel for the sake of it. I'm telling you what I observed because it matters for what happened later. The image Stephanie had constructed in her mind, the Jason who was easy, the Jason who planned beach trips, the Jason she should have married, was a preserved version from years ago. A version curated by nostalgia and never updated by reality. That version and the current version were not the same person. But Stephanie didn't know that yet. She was about to find out. I want to describe how I decided to handle the confrontation, because it wasn't impulsive and it wasn't dramatic. I didn't invite people over for a theatrical reveal. I didn't plan some elaborate scene. Those things work in stories. In real life, they create noise and distraction and emotion that takes focus away from the actual thing that needs to happen. What I did was choose a specific evening, a weekday, a Wednesday, because of its significance, and I set the conditions for a clear, direct conversation with no exits. I prepared what I needed to have available, printed copies of the receipt and a few other relevant items. The location data summary I'd put together, Dana's text exchange, nothing I'd obtained illegally. Nothing I needed to be ashamed of presenting. I arranged for these to be on the kitchen table when Stephanie came home that Wednesday evening, and then I waited. She came home at 9:40, freshly showered, gym bag over her shoulder. She came into the kitchen, saw the table, and stopped. She looked at the papers, then she looked at me. Her face went through several things in quick succession, confusion first, then recognition, then something I can only describe as a controlled recalibration. The look of someone running an emergency assessment of what exactly is known and what the right move is. She sat down slowly. "What is this?" she said. "You know what it is," I said. She picked up the receipt. She held it. She put it down. "Eric, I'm not asking you to explain the receipt," I said. "I already know what it means. I'm telling you I know, so that we don't waste each other's time." She was quiet. "How long?" I said. She looked at me. "Eric, it's not. How long, Stephanie?" She folded her hands on the table. Her voice, when it came, was controlled. Quicker than normal, but controlled. "About 4 months. 4 months, at minimum." "Jason," I said, not a question. She didn't answer, which was an answer. I nodded. "Okay," I said. "Here's where we are.